But I'm really glad we could all get together again. As usual, twice a year, we have an opportunity to meet, catch up, maintain our good relationships, meet new folks along the way as new folks come into our field. And it's always an opportunity, I believe, is to raise the tide so all of our boats are risen so we can really help our patients in our community. And I'm also grateful for the support we have from industry to make sure that this can happen, and I'll make more comments on that at the close of our meeting tonight. But I want to share a story with you. It's sort of my discovery of how tonight has come to be. And that is, I got an email May of 2016. This is an email that said, "Hey, Dr. Mersol-Barg, I'm getting a few nice reviews here, and I want you to know that I really appreciate the feedback we're getting." And all I saw over this was junk mail. And it was from this place called Fertility IQ. I thought, is it an oxymoron? I wasn't really sure what it was about. But I sort of just tucked it away in my email file under something. And, I looked at the website. It was sort of newbie and didn't really get a feel for it. I left it there. And then a year later, there was a follow-up email, and I remember hearing this before, and I went online and I looked at it. An hour and a half later, I was done with the website. I read stuff, and what struck me was, this is Consumer Reports, if you will, as we know it for products. This was truly Consumer Reports for reproductive medicine. As I read through things, the standards that were set for sources of information and the experts that were on there with videos, with information, and asking questions that I think all of us here, our patients, ask all the time, with real answers, answers that were cogent, easy to read, easy to consume. And we're all learners, either visual learners or reading learners, and there were different ways in which people could absorb information. And I went, holy cow, this is something real. And there wasn't, if you will, any influence at any one center. There wasn't marketing into it from influence, whether it's from, and I want to call it industry, including reproductive endocrinologists and the new virtual capital area, the VCs that are purchasing other places. None of that was involved in this. It wasn't besmirched, if you will, and could set up in the way that I think the Consumer Reports organization does for other products for consumers. And I kept following, and I said, this is really interesting stuff. And even in the reviews were far more detailed. And some of my patients said they filled things out, but were never asked these kind of questions on Yelp or who knows what. And so I called Jake Anderson, who's our guest speaker tonight. And I wanted to know, what's up? What is this all about? He's going to share that with me. But I think it's emerged as something quite unique, and it's been picked up in national news organizations as resources of information that's useful. And we often, and most often in our meetings here, we have also thought leaders from all aspects of reproductive medicine come, but it's through the lens of we as providers, whether it's from our front office team, to our expert nurses, to our expert scientists and laboratory scientists, to our physicians and physician scientists. It's been always through our lens of science and technology. And we all like to find comfort in that we do listen to our patients, but I found myself in reading through Fertility IQ, I found myself personally challenged is not to get too comfortable with thinking that it's so smooth and easy, and it made me pause and really begin to see through the lens of our patients in a much more clear way. And I thought, I got to see whether Jake will come and talk to our group, because I think there's something really valuable here. So Jake can tell you his story, and Deborah, who started this, and there's some laser and one in the oven, perhaps. But in any case, I'd like to introduce you tonight, delightfully, Jake Anderson. There's a mic here.
Got it. Can you hear me okay? Well, it's great to meet you. Thank you for inviting me here. My wife Deborah is at home with our son Laser, who's 18 months old, and so they weren't able to make the trip. So you have the junior varsity squad in front of you. And what I was hoping to do was to cover a few things about us. One is a little bit of background on Fertility IQ, and I can tell you about Deborah and me and why on God's green earth someone would spend the time working on what we're working on. And then I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the notion of the value of online reputation. I think we've come to believe that how patients perceive doctors and clinics and nurses and how they espouse their feelings about them does matter in terms of how it's perceived by prospective new patients, and I'll show you some data around that. I'd love to chat with you, or at least show you what we think of the evolution of what reviews looks like, both in terms of how it's historically been and what we're working on and what we think will be the future. And then last, just some generalizable lessons that we've got from about 10,000 verified IVF patients that have provided us their data, and which gets seen by probably about 70% of all new fertility patients in the US nationally. And then that's probably more true for patients in cities like New York and Chicago and San Francisco. So without delay, we'll get cracking. So this is a picture of Deborah and me on our wedding day in LA. And you know, I think we're kind of prototypical couple. Like, you know, we met in our mid to late 20s. You know, we got rolling really fast in a relationship and got over our skis and fell in love, and then got married. And then we had this sort of startling moment where we realized we had to go to a fertility clinic. Our path was a little unconventional because my wife has a history of ovarian cyst rupture, and if one of her ovaries had to be removed, it obviously foreclosed on her chance to become a biological mother. And so we found ourselves at a fertility clinic really early on in the process, and I would dare say without even an infertility diagnosis. And so what we originally started doing was we were just going to bank embryos. And then what we came to realize is that we weren't getting many embryos that passed PGS testing. And this started out as a prophylactic, belts and suspenders, let's get ahead of this kind of thing, to like, you know, holy Toledo, you know, we're in our 20s. Are we not going to be able to have kids? Which, as you can imagine, is a great way to kick off a marriage under that type of duress. So Deborah and I went to a handful of fertility clinics, and I think the experience was very mixed. I fault ourselves because we were very underprepared for what the nature of the process would be. I mean, we didn't understand what ICSI was, with what PGS was. You know, mosaicism was not something that was being talked about at this point. We were just totally underprepared. And in my mind, that was our failure. I think if you go and buy a car, you buy a house, you really need to understand the trade-offs of what you're going to buy and why. And Deborah and I were woefully underprepared. So Deborah and I just sort of made a promise to each other. If we were ever in a position in our lives where we could come back and revisit the issue and help elucidate for patients the things that we would have preferred to have known at the outset of our journey, we'd like to do so. And we've been in a position to do that, and Fertility IQ is kind of the manifestation of that effort. In our minds, we've made some nice progress, but this is really the end of the beginning, and we feel like there's a lot more work to do. So we kind of try and do two things, really. One is we really focus on educating patients about sort of the higher level salient issues, and then we do some stuff around patient assessments that I'll get to. But we try and cover the real meat and potatoes of what matters if you're a fertility patient to know about. And whether, you know, you're a single mother by choice and you need a sperm donor, if you're an egg freezer, if you're in a heterosexual relationship, if you know, you're in an LGBT relationship, everybody cuts a different path, but there are certain things that all patients probably need to be familiar with. And so we really try and get patients up to speed on concepts like, you know, the nature of the labs, the costs you're gonna have to think through, how many embryos to transfer, just the basic stuff for a lot of patients, which matters. And then we do this by providing lots of data. Occasionally we'll rope in a clinician that we feel like is well published, that's unbiased, who's gonna present stuff in a dispassionate and evidence-based way. And then we work with lots of different types of clinicians from various types of places. But you know, it's rare that you'll see like Cornell and, for instance, NYU on the same, you know, on the same slide, because they see things very differently, day 3 versus day 5, how much ICSI or PGS. But we really try and work with a broad spectrum of clinicians. And then we can talk about the assessments in a second. So this is somewhat like what some people have to say about us. What Jamie Griffo and Peter Schlegel, who are from different clinics, who have different disciplines, but I think would tell you that our heart's in the right place and we're trying to educate patients in a way that's useful. And as an example of some of the subjects we cover, in our minds, the lab, I mean, the lab is the business in a lot of ways. And if patients can understand what separates a superb lab from a mediocre lab, then we can be of real use. And so, here's some of the stuff that we'll cover. For instance, there's an article by Jacques Cohen at the NIH about how long your eggs or your embryos can be stored for. Jason Swain at CCRM, who penned something about the value of being at 5% versus 20% when it comes to low oxygen within the incubators. Eric Foreman, who's now at Columbia, was at RMA of New Jersey, about what the heck do we do about mosaicism? Do we tell patients? Do we not tell patients? Where's the cutoff point? To what degree will a mosaic embryo lead to a live birth compared to aneuploid or euploid? These are the subjects we really try and cover, and we got to make sure that they're accurate and that patients can absorb them, and that it leads to a healthy discussion and we don't get people screwed up with too much information. And that's a fine line that we've got to walk. So just to give you a sense for some of the frameworks that we try and offer patients. So when talking about the lab, we'll say, listen, let's ask about what their fertilization rate is for both ICSI and conventional. What's their blast conversion rate? How good are they at biopsying? What's their freeze and thaw rate? Things of that nature. You may recognize this partially comes from the MSREI and what a handful of embryologists from there classified to be excellent and passable. And we try and make constructs like this useful to a patient. So the other thing that we do, or I should really say that patients do, is patients come to us and they assess their doctor and their clinic and the nursing and the billing department. So a patient will come to us, and typically, most often it's a she. She'll invest probably between 30 to 45 minutes accounting what their experience was like with their fertility doctor and their nurse in their clinic. And as I said, it's about 10,000 patients today that have done so in the last year and a half. We think that this is probably about 5% of all IVF patients. We don't push. Patients hear about this organically from other patients and say, I would really like to contribute. I don't know if in other bodies of healthcare, whether patients would feel so compelled to educate other patients about what their experience was like. I'm not sure in orthopedics if they would do it or if they would do it in cardiology, but we're in a field where I think patients feel a yearning to educate other patients about what was superb or less than superb about their doctor or clinic, or just what to prepare for so that it goes, so when you go in there, it goes as well as possible. So just to give you a sense for like what, how the value of online reputation and why we think that this part is really important. We asked about 600 of our patients, how many other women do you know in the city who have done IVF in your town? And the vast preponderance, over 50%, the answer was 0 or 1. And then when we said, how helpful would it be to hear from other patients like you about which clinic they went to, just about everybody said extremely valuable or quite valuable. Most patients don't have the tributaries of information to hear about different clinics and doctors in a rigorous way. And we feel like, this sort of elucidates how eager patients are to hear almost from anybody. And then when we asked patients that came to our site, did you think, what were you looking for when you came? Was it to find many doctors? Were you trying to figure out if this was the right doctor? It's generally a pretty good mix. And most patients will tell you that they found the data to be really helpful. So there's probably some sort of thirst out there from patients to hear from other patients because they simply just do not have a context of other patients in their area. And reviews we think of reviews as kind of a pejorative. Deborah and I are very dismissive about what fertility reviews look like in general. When we ourselves were patients, we lived off a diet of chat boards and reviews that we felt were eminently unhelpful. And so this is an example of a review by us. We live in San Francisco, by the way, and this is of PFC. And this is the #3 assessment on Yelp. And as you see, it's a 1 through 5 star metric. This patient was treated 15 years ago, and it's the #3 review. You have no idea if this patient's real. You have no context for their age, their diagnosis, the treatment type. They spent half the review talking about how great some other doctor was. I think Deborah and I are very sensitive to what this augurs, which is if you're a clinician and you spend your career trying to burnish a reputation, when you have sites like this that are up and people can just sound off however, and it gets attention, it's a very scary proposition and place to be in. I know if I were a clinician, I feel very at ease knowing that this is what people are consulting and using. And as patients, Deborah and I felt like this was, you know, false precision at best and counterproductive at worst. And so when people say you're like the Yelp of fertility, I mean, Deborah and I really cringe at that, because this is the antithesis of what we want to be. And every decision that we've made has been to work against what this provides. So let me give you a sense for what our site sort of offers. When you come to our site, as Michael mentioned, the assessments look different. You get a very clear assessment of who the patient is, how old, were they successful when they were treated, how much money do they make. Obviously, somebody who's got a ton of cash to burn on IVF might think very differently than somebody who this is their last shot. Maybe it's transfer multiple embryos because we're not coming back. Maybe it's go big or go home from a protocol perspective because I cannot afford to be back. And knowing the context of how much this person makes can be useful. How many doctors they've been to, how many treatments, what were their underlying etiology, all the things that you would need to know to characterize. Do I have anything in common with this person? If yes, I may listen to what they have to say. If not, it may not make sense to dwell too long on their experience, because we're fundamentally different people with different needs who are going to blaze a different path and who have different resources. The next thing you'll see here is this check mark. Most patients send us a document that proves they actually went to the clinic. So usually it ends up being an image of a bill, image of a credit card receipt, image of a treatment plan. But from our mind, this is really important to raise the level of veracity, and we require it if the assessment is low. So if the tone is constructive, but they're critical of the doctor in the clinic, they still have to send us this, or we're not going to publish it. We just don't know who somebody is, and we can't run the risk, given how much attention the site gets, that we are putting stuff up here that's not for real. So we take this manual step where we'll read every one of these things to make sure we get a review, but we do it because we feel like, you know, that's what's at stake here, are people's reputations. And then we just feel like the nature of what people provide us is more useful. People spend a lot of time open text writing. You know, this person, you know, like the clinician, did feel like they were a bit of a number. They felt like the nurses were on autopilot. The patient pretty much had a high AMH, so they ended up going with the Lupron antagonist protocol because they were probably very fearful of OHSS or overstimulating. They did a freeze-all cycle because they were afraid of it. Didn't feel like the coordinator was truthfully that great, but they rarely had a long wait. So this is, we feel like, more context and more depth and more information. So even if you went to this place, you'd kind of be prepared for the strengths or weaknesses as this person perceived it. So we think this is kind of night and day versus what patients have had to work with until this point. And the next thing that we've just sort of introduced, like in the last few months, is, okay, we've got all these reviews, but you know what, there's such a thing as too much reviews and it's too little time. So just show me patients that are like me. Let's cut through the clutter. Don't make me read 40 reviews that aren't germane. So we allow you to say, okay, you know, my age is 40, I'm interested in donor egg, I have DOR, I'm Ashkenazi Jewish, I make this amount of money, and then we surface for you the assessments that hit those criteria. And so we can cut through all the reviews that frankly just aren't applicable to your situation. And not all of them are direct hits. You know, as you go further down the line, we have fewer and fewer direct hits. But, you know, in our mind, this is kind of what's the more helpful alternative. And this is an example of women that thread that needle, that are Ashkenazi Jewish women that make this amount of money, that are doing donor egg with DOR above 40. And we have a long list of them in New York. This is another example. East Asian woman who's an egg freezer, who's an entrepreneur, makes between 100 and 200K. I mean, we're kind of cutting it pretty fine at this point, and that's why you need a lot of volume, is because once you allow for people to filter at this level, you've got to have enough for them. Filtering with too few reviews doesn't really get you anything, and so we've moved to this version of the world that, frankly, to save people time. So fundamentally, Deborah and I really don't think there's such a thing as good doctor, good clinic, bad. We just don't agree with that. We think there are good matches for people out there, and you really got to find people whose strengths and characteristics and the way the labs run comport with your own wishes and your own budget and your own time frame and your own propensity or aversion to certain types of drugs. And you know, that's kind of how we look at the world. So we really think about this as you got to match people up and For that reason, when people say, oh, I rank highly or don't, we don't really view it that way. We try and make it so that people can find other patients like them and get a sense for how those patients felt and use that as a proxy for how you might feel at this place. So our process is pretty simple. Effectively, patients answer about 100 questions. They send us in a verification most of the time. Like I said, we're 10,000 or so IVF patients today. Then we go ahead and manually read every one of these things to make sure the tone's constructive. And so if it feels like there's a patient with an axe to grind, if the language isn't helpful, if it's full of hyperbole, oh, she has the highest success rates, or he's only in it for the money, we don't run it. We'll say you're welcome to try again, and these are the areas that we had problems with. But if we don't feel like this is meant to be something to be helpful, we just tell people we're not using it. And you can imagine, people aren't exactly thrilled with us when they invest that kind of time and we say we can't go with it. But it's our job to be on the firing line for stuff like this. Deborah and I run the site, and we can't have anything up there that we're not proud of. And so we know what it's like when patients redirect their ire right at us. But that's our job. Like, we're responsible for this. And so we take these manual steps because we think it's important. We have a team of 5 other women distributed throughout the U.S. who've all been through IVF that also will read reviews at home. Sometimes it's while the baby's sleeping or when they get back from work. There's just too many reviews for Deborah and me to do a responsible job reading them all at this point. And then new patients come in, as you saw, they sort of sort and filter. And this year we'll have probably about 200,000 IVF patients or fertility patients who will go to a clinic. These are unique patients that'll come to the site during the year. At some point we'll top out because there are only so many fertility patients in this country, unless you believe there's an ocean of egg freezers and people from China. So ultimately these numbers will top out. And then the clinics use our data. We pretty much say the data's almost in the public domain in our minds. If you want to use this data to look longitudinally about how you've done versus a year ago, or comparatively, like how Press-Ganey's used, comparing yourself to other peer clinics, go for it. If this helps you provide a better service, that's very much in line with what Deborah and I would hope. And so we make the data available to lots of people, CCRM, Stanford, Columbia, anybody who wants to try and use it to improve. And so just to give you a sense for the types of stuff that patients are answering, a lot on fertility history, diagnosis. We just get a lot of patient demographic information. We get very granular on the treatment level, so we'll know number of eggs retrieved, number fertilized, number of embryos created, number of embryos frozen, number of embryos transferred, number of embryos still in the bank per patient. We do the same thing for egg freezers, so we know the number of eggs retrieved, number of eggs stored, etc. So we have a lot of really detailed data. We don't show it on the site because we'd overwhelm people. Half our traffic is mobile, and no one wants to sit on the back of a bus looking at that level data. But we capture a lot of very nuanced data, and then the outcomes that go with it. Lots of questions on the doctors, nurse, clinic, billing department, responsiveness, errors, and then we do a lot around cost. This cost data is helpful. We use it to try and put out literature that we think is helpful. So we just had a piece in the New York Times last week where we published what effectively most of the large employers throughout the U.S. cover in terms of dollar limit, how much money, how much from a medication perspective, what the pre-authorizations are, et cetera, and then we force rank them. And we use that, frankly, so that patients can use that as ammo to go and talk to their clinic, talk to their employer and say, every other investment bank except for us covers this, this is now considered norm. Can we do this? And so anyhow, the data that we collect, we really feel like can be used for good for lots of different ways. That would be one example. And then I thought I would just show you some generalizable lessons, having tried to sift through the data best we can to see if there was any signal amongst all the noise that we get. And I thought a few things might be interesting to this group. So this is an eye chart. Forgive me, I did a poor job constructing this, but I'll try and lay out for you what this says. So we asked effectively a few hundred patients. These were like some of our earliest patients, and the data still is held up. But these are patients that failed IVF, or IVF failed them, however you want to phrase it, but their cycle did not work. And so we asked patients who failed, were you treated like a number or like a human being? If they gave a 5, they said I was treated like a human being. I felt great about how I was treated. And if they said I was given, if I wasn't treated very well, it was a 1, okay? And then what this effectively says is, if you failed treatment, but you thought you were a 5, you loved the way you were treated, but failed treatment, 62% of these patients said that they would give their doctor a high score. They'd come back. They're known as promoters. Now, if the patient failed treatment and they're ambivalent about how they were treated, they gave the doctor a 3 on the humanities scale, only 5% would come back. And if the patient failed treatment and they gave the doctor in clinic a terrible score about how they were treated, there is 1% come back. I mean, there's just no way they're coming back. And so, you know, one of the questions Deborah and I had to ourselves was, well, the only thing people care about is if they get a child, right? Like at the end of the day, it's pretty binary. And I think when this, and no question, that is the strongest coefficient to how people feel is, did they have a child? But patients where the cycle fails can still be thrilled with their doctor and their clinic. I think a lot of it deals with how they perceive they were treated. And so, you know, we're in a world where obviously the majority of cycles fail, and it's easy to be a fatalist and just say, well, there's nothing I could have done. That person was going to be displeased regardless. And that may be true to an extent, but I think we've got a reasonable amount of data that shows that patients can be more, not all of them, but many of them can be more discerning. And we looked at this in a few different ways. Adaptability. We asked a question, how much did your clinician adapt treatment? Now there's a question there, can a patient really discern how much you adapt treatment? I mean, if you don't change, you know, if you're not going from, you know, long protocol to, you know, something different, maybe it's not a big change. But to the extent that patients feel as though you adapt treatment, same thing. If you failed treatment, but you thought your doctor really adapted treatment, 80% come back for the next cycle and will recommend it to somebody else. But the second they fail treatment and they feel like they're ambivalent about how scrappy their doctor was about getting to the bottom of it, they're gone. They're not coming back, at least according to our data. And this is only a few hundred patients of IVF patients, but it's held up pretty much at this point. Same is true to a slightly lesser extent about the expectations that are laid out for patients. So patients feel like the expectations were very clear and the expectations were in line with reality, they're likely to come back. To a lesser extent, if they're ambivalent than in the others, they're more likely to stick around, but still far less likely if they really felt like the expectations were well laid out. If the expectations were poorly laid out and they failed, they're gone. So thought that might be useful and for people to see. And we see it across diagnoses, parts of the country, treatment type. It's reasonably durable, we feel like. This goes as well for how well run was the clinic. And to a lesser extent, but still somewhat the billing department. So if you fail treatment, but you feel like the billing department was excellent, you know, you might come back. But if you fail treatment and you hated the billing department, that's probably it. And no judgment on, you know, the billing department's got a tough job. I mean, the billing department has an incredibly hard job. So I don't mean that to be a proxy for quality. I think it's really a proxy for how the patient perceives the billing department. No commentary on whether the billing department does a superb job, because, you know, if you're dealing with a patient with insurance and things get mucked up, you could be doing your job terrifically well, but from a patient perspective, it's frustrating. But it may have gone as well as it possibly could have in your hands. The patient just may not appreciate that. So the next thing I wanted to show you was, and I want to make this a combination of showing you data and examples. We've got data that backs this up. Here's a clinician by us in San Francisco, Amy Avazadeh. And I don't know much about Amy's practice. She gets effusive praise from her patients. And we ask patients usually what sort of means of communication you have to your doctor. And, you know, do you have their email? Do you have their office phone? Do you have their, you know, their cell phone? And if you look at Amy's reviews qualitatively, almost to a person, 11 out of the 15 say some variant on, she answers me immediately. Always on, answers me immediately, picks up her own phone. And I think the reason I bring this up, not meant to be a suggestion that all of a sudden you give out patient phone numbers, but I think sometimes when we talk a doctor will say, well, listen, the best I can do is practice great medicine, and after that, that's it. And I think that is true. I would just posit this as an example of, this is a person who probably couldn't practice better medicine than she does, but she's decided from a lifestyle decision perspective, she's comfortable giving out that phone number. And whether that quells anxiety that patients has or whether it actually leads to better treatment, I can't say. But her patients will walk in front of traffic for her because she does this. And personally, I don't think I would do it. But I do think it's an example of, and we see this with more younger clinicians, they're being amenable to providing their cell phone, answering texts. I have no idea how you prevent things from happening when you're not in front of the EMR answering questions in a disciplined way. But we see that the clinicians that give out their cell phone number as an example, even when we level set and isolate out most of the other variables, patients tend to appreciate it. Next thing I was just going to show you about error rates. So we asked patients, did you experience any one of these 15 errors? Maybe it's 16 errors. And it's really a combination of clinical and clerical errors. And it's everything from, did they order the wrong test or not consider a drug-drug interaction, which I'd put the, medical serious end of the spectrum, to this annoying but maybe benign, didn't receive a call that day with my results, where vexing but doesn't probably change what your outcome will be. And so we get this, long list of what clinics have what errors as patients perceive them. And what we noticed is typically if a clinic ends up having one error, the patient will deduct about 2 points from their score. So we rank things sort of on a 0 through 10 basis. And when we isolate out a lot of the variables, if we just get one error, usually that score ends up being about 2 points lower. In the histogram of the errors, it's not like one thing. I expected that it was going to be all did not call with results, because we hear about that all the time. But that ended up not being the most popular one. In fact, it was kind of flat. There wasn't anything that was more than 1/7 of the total errors here. But providing conflicting information is certainly the top one. And one of the things that we saw that was sort of interesting to us is we wanted to look at this maybe based on academic versus non, or maybe by cycle volume size. And what we saw typically is the academic medical centers ended up having a higher number of medical errors. When we sort of pushed aside the clerical errors, we wanted to focus on medical. And and this met statistical significance, and when we isolated out the variables, it was comfortably over the confidence intervals. And then from a cycle volume perspective, we sort of noticed as the cycle volumes grew, we saw the patient-reported error rate climb. And then over 1,000 cycles, it looked like that number dropped. And this has generally been true as the data set has grown. And we could speculate why that may be the case. One point of view is maybe they're just growing pains, but once a clinic's over 1,000 cycles, they've got some process in place, and you start to hear the verbiage like well-oiled machine. We can't say for certain. If this is true, there's probably a bunch of underlying factors, again, if it's true. And once we, obviously there's a confounder here between academic medical center and cycle volume. Once we isolate it out for that, it still is statistically significant, these disparities based on size. So effectively, that was kind of what I wanted to show you. Hopefully this was useful in some way. There's lots more we didn't cover. I'd be happy to answer anything that we know about. And for the moment, that's all. Thank you very much.